The sky shimmered with a brilliance beyond human comprehension, a light so pure it seemed to hum with life itself. From the heights of heaven, a host of radiant beings watched over the earth. They were the Watchers, celestial sentinels chosen to guard the fragile creation below. Each of them bore an otherworldly beauty, their forms glowing with a serene light, and their hearts were bound by duty to protect humanity. At first, they observed from the vastness above, unseen yet ever-present. They marveled at the simplicity of human life, its fleeting moments of joy and sorrow, the rhythms of birth and death, the quiet prayers whispered under starlit skies. The Watchers were filled with a strange kind of awe, for though they were powerful and eternal, humanity possessed something they did not, a tender vulnerability that made every moment precious. Among the Watchers was Shemihaza, their leader, whose piercing gaze seemed to capture the very essence of the heavens. He carried the weight of his role with solemn dignity, his voice like the calm before a storm. Beside him stood Azazel, fierce and restless, a spark of curiosity ever burning in his eyes. Together, they held sway over the hearts of their brethren, keeping their gaze fixed firmly on their purpose. But as the seasons turned, something began to shift. The Watchers, who once stood apart like guardians carved from light, found themselves drawn closer to the world they were meant to protect. From their lofty posts, they watched humanity build homes and families, sow fields, and kindle fires against the cold. Laughter echoed across the hills, songs rose in celebration, and quiet tears fell in mourning. The Watchers, for all their wisdom, had never known such depths of feeling. Then came the moment when curiosity gave way to longing. It was a single night, quiet and still, when Shemihaza gazed upon the world with an intensity he had never felt before. The stars reflected in his eyes seemed dim compared to the glow of a human child cradled by its mother. He turned to his brethren, his voice heavy with the weight of forbidden desire. Why should we only watch? Why should we stand apart when the world is so alive, so full of beauty? Azazel stepped forward, emboldened by the thought. They are so much like us, and yet so different. What harm would it do to walk among them? To teach them? To share what we know? There were murmurs among the Watchers, soft at first, but growing louder. They spoke of love and life, of what it would mean to be a part of the world instead of standing apart from it. Some hesitated, torn between their duty and the pull of something they could not name. Others, emboldened by Shemihaza's words, began to dream of a different existence, one where they could touch and feel, love and be loved. On a moonlit night, high atop Mount Hermon, the Watchers gathered. Their forms shone like a crown of fire against the dark sky, their wings shimmering as they stood in solemn deliberation. It was Shemihaza who spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with an unspoken fear. If we are to act, we must act together. None can stand apart, for if we fall as one. They swore an oath that bound them in rebellion, a pact sealed not with words, but with the very essence of their being. As the oath was spoken, the stars seemed to dim, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the choice being made. And so, the Watchers descended. Their arrival was not marked by thunder or fire, but by the quiet awe of their presence. They walked among humans, shedding their radiant forms for shapes that could be touched and held. They brought gifts of knowledge, secrets of the stars, the workings of the earth, the mysteries of the forge. Under their tutelage, humanity flourished, crafting tools, building cities, and unlocking the hidden potential of the world around them. But the Watchers' gifts came with a cost. The knowledge they shared began to warp the hearts of men, turning their thoughts to power and conquest. The delicate balance of creation faltered, and the innocence the Watchers had so admired began to fade. Yet, they were too enraptured by their new lives to see the cracks forming in the foundation of the world. Among them, Shemihaza bore the heaviest burden. He had led his brethren into this new existence, yet as he watched the world change, a shadow of doubt began to grow within him. He saw the violence that followed the forging of weapons, the pride that consumed the hearts of men who claimed dominion over the earth. He looked to Azazel, who reveled in the chaos, his teachings of warfare and forbidden arts spreading like wildfire. Even more troubling were the children born of their union with humanity. The Nephilim, towering giants of unmatched strength, roamed the earth. They were beautiful and terrifying, their laughter shaking the mountains and their anger splitting the earth. They were neither wholly angelic nor human, and their presence disrupted the fragile harmony of creation. Shemhaza watched as the Nephilim grew, their shadows stretching long over the land. He could no longer ignore the feeling gnawing at his soul, a sense of betrayal, not of others, but of himself. Yet, he remained silent, bound by the pact he had sworn. The Watchers, who once stood as guardians of humanity, now found themselves entangled in the very fabric of the world they had sworn to protect. Their rebellion, born of longing and love, had sown the seeds of a great and terrible change. The air grew heavy with the weight of what had been done, and though the Watchers still walked among humans, a sense of foreboding lingered, like the calm before an impending storm. The night on Mount Hermon was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. The stars above flickered faintly, their usual brilliance dulled as shadows stretched long across the ancient stones. A gathering of otherworldly figures stood in the cold silence, their forms flickering with the remnants of celestial light, now muted by an unspoken burden. At the center of the gathering stood Shemhaza. His gaze, fierce and unwavering, swept across the faces of his brethren. There was no trace of doubt in his expression, yet a strange sorrow lingered in his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a decision that would ripple through the fabric of creation. "We have watched from afar," he began, each word cutting through the stillness like the edge of a blade. "We have seen their lives, their joys, their pains. Is it just to remain distant, to deny ourselves the fullness of what they are allowed to feel?" The words hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. Some of the Watchers shifted uneasily, their luminous forms dimming as if conflicted. But others leaned closer, their eyes burning with something darker, something that had been growing within them for longer than they cared to admit. It was Azazel who stepped forward, his presence like a spark on dry tinder. His voice was not as steady as Shemhaza's, but it carried a raw passion that stirred the hearts of those who heard him. "Why should we not walk among them?" he asked, his tone both challenging and seductive. "We are not mindless servants, bound to observe and do nothing. We have the power to shape, to teach, to rule. Why should we not claim what is rightfully ours?" A murmur ran through the assembly, a low, tremulous sound like the first rumble of an approaching storm. For a moment, no one spoke, as if waiting for the heavens to strike them down for their boldness. But the skies remained silent, and in that silence, courage, dangerous, intoxicating courage, began to bloom. Shemhaza raised a hand, his voice cutting through the rising clamor. "We cannot act alone. To do this is to defy the will of the Most High. If we are to descend, to take what we desire, we must do so together. All of us, bound by a single oath. There can be no turning back." The stillness that followed was almost suffocating. The Watchers looked at one another, searching for reassurance, for strength, for the spark of rebellion in their brothers' eyes. One by one, they began to nod, their resolve hardening like steel in a forge. The gathering moved closer, forming a circle on the summit. The wind, once gentle, now howled as if in protest, tearing at their forms with icy fingers. The stars above seemed to dim even further, their light retreating from the choice being made below. Shemhaza spoke again, his voice rising above the wind, commanding and unyielding. "Swear it now, by all that we are. Swear that we will stand together, that none will falter, none will betray. Swear that we will descend and take what has been denied to us." Azazel was the first to speak the words, his voice filled with a fervor that seemed to ignite the very air around him. One by one, the others followed, their voices weaving together in a dark harmony. The oath echoed across the mountain, a sound that carried both triumph and tragedy. As the last voice fell silent, a strange stillness returned, but it was no longer the stillness of hesitation. It was the calm certainty of a storm about to break. As the oath bound them together, something shifted in their hearts. Where there had once been hesitation, there was now resolve. Where there had been duty, there was now desire. Lust burned bright in their eyes, not just for the beauty of human women but for the freedom to live as they chose, unshackled from the constraints of their divine purpose. Azazel's lips curled into a smile, a sharp, dangerous thing. They will sing songs of us, he said, his voice dripping with a mix of pride and hunger. Not as watchers, but as gods. We will teach them wonders they cannot imagine. And they will worship us for it. Shemhaza did not smile. His expression remained inscrutable, his thoughts hidden even from his closest brethren. But he gave a single nod, a silent acknowledgement that the moment had passed, and the path they had chosen could not be undone. As the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the watchers turned their gazes downward, toward the world they were about to claim. The light of the rising sun seemed harsh against their once radiant forms, now marked by the shadow of rebellion. They descended not with thunder or fanfare, but with quiet determination. Their footsteps carried the weight of their oath, their presence marked by an unearthly power that made the very air around them hum with tension. They were no longer mere observers of humanity, they were its new architects, its new rulers. In their hearts burned the fire of their desires, some for love, some for power, and some for the sheer thrill of freedom. But beneath it all, there was something deeper, darker, a sense that they were not just rebelling against their purpose, but against the divine order itself. And though the heavens remained silent, the watchers could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the weight of their choice would follow them far beyond the bounds of the world they had descended to claim. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long, silver shadows across the earth. Beneath its glow, a quiet unease lingered, as if the very air trembled with anticipation. The watchers had descended, their otherworldly forms cloaked in human guise. What was once untouchable had now come to dwell among humanity, and the boundary between the divine and the mortal began to blur. It started with stolen glances. The women of the earth, unassuming in their simple beauty, went about their lives, unaware of the unseen eyes that followed them. There was something about their laughter, their kindness, the way they carried both strength and tenderness, that stirred a longing in the hearts of the watchers. They had never known such raw humanity, so flawed, so fleeting, and yet so breathtakingly alive. Shemhaza, who had led the rebellion, watched from a distance at first. His resolve, once ironclad, began to waver as he observed a young woman, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she worked in the fields. She sang as she moved, her voice a soft, lilting melody that seemed to reach into his very soul. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, and it unraveled something within him that he could not name. Azazel, bolder and more reckless, was the first to step forward. His gaze burned with intensity as he approached a woman by the river, her arms laden with water jars. She started when she saw him, his presence radiating an otherworldly power that made the air seem heavier around him. But Azazel's words were smooth, his voice honeyed with charm. "Do not fear," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "I have watched you from afar, and I cannot look away." The others followed, each drawn to a woman whose beauty or spirit spoke to something long dormant within them. Their love, or perhaps obsession, was not gentle. It was all-consuming, like a fire that could not be quenched. The women, at first bewildered, were soon enchanted by the watchers, who seemed to glow with a light that made everything else fade into shadow. They were strong and wise, their words woven with promises that felt like dreams made real. But their unions were not natural. The celestial mingled with the mortal, and from these unions were born children who were neither fully human nor fully divine. The Nephilim. Giants who towered over men, their strength unmatched and their appetites insatiable. At first, they were celebrated, seen as miracles, proof of the Watcher's divinity. Fathers beamed with pride as their sons lifted boulders with ease, their voices like thunder as they laughed. Mothers marveled at their daughters, whose beauty seemed to rival the stars. Yet it did not take long for wonder to turn to fear. The Nephilim, with their unmatched power, soon became a force beyond control. They devoured the earth's resources, their hunger endless and unchecked. Forests were felled to feed their insatiable appetites, rivers ran dry as they drank their fill. And as they grew in power, so too did their arrogance. They saw themselves not as children of both worlds, but as rulers over all. The corruption spread like a shadow across the earth. The Nephilim, once playful and curious, turned to violence. Their games became wars, their laughter replaced with roars of conquest. They built towering fortresses and demanded tribute from the people who once adored them. Those who resisted were crushed beneath their feet, their cries of defiance drowned out by the Nephilim's mighty bellows. The Watchers, who had once stood as guardians of humanity, now looked on in silence. Some, like Shemihaza, were haunted by guilt, their luminous forms dimming as the weight of their actions pressed heavily upon them. He would stand atop the hills, watching as his sons ravaged the lands below, his heart breaking with every cry for mercy that echoed through the valleys. Azazel, however, reveled in the chaos. He walked among his offspring like a king, his laughter booming as he encouraged their conquests. "This is what it means to rule," he told them, his voice filled with pride. "You are the true masters of this world, and none shall stand against you." But the world was not made to bear such weight. The earth groaned under the strain of the Nephilim's dominion, its once fertile fields turned to barren wastelands. The rivers, once teeming with life, grew still and lifeless. The sky itself seemed darker, the sun veiled by the smoke of endless fires. The humans, too, began to change. Under the rule of the Nephilim, they learned cruelty and greed, mimicking the giants' insatiable hunger for power. The Watchers, who had once loved humanity for its innocence, now saw that innocence wither before their eyes. The laughter of children, the gentle songs of mothers, the quiet prayers of fathers, all were drowned out by the cacophony of a world tearing itself apart. And yet, the Nephilim did not stop. They could not stop. Their existence was a paradox, a blending of worlds that should never have been joined. They were too much for the world to bear, their strength a curse as much as it was a gift. Wherever they walked, destruction followed, and the once beautiful earth was reduced to ash and ruin. The women who had once gazed at the Watchers with love now looked at them with fear. The men who had welcomed them as brothers now turned their backs, their eyes filled with bitterness and betrayal. The Watchers, who had sought freedom and love, now found themselves trapped in a world of their own making, a world that was falling apart. As the sun set over the shattered lands, the shadows of the Nephilim stretched long and dark across the earth. Their laughter echoed like a haunting melody, a reminder of what had been lost. And in the silence that followed, the Watchers stood apart, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had traded the light of heaven for a world that could no longer hold them. The night sky, once a tapestry of calm stars, now seemed troubled, its light dimmed by something unspoken. On the earth below, fires crackled in strange circles, their flames casting unnatural shadows on faces both fearful and eager. The Watchers, no longer mere observers, stood among men and women, their presence radiant but stained with something darker. Shemihaza's voice was steady as he addressed the crowd gathered around him. "This world holds more than you have ever dreamed. Power lies in your hands, if you are bold enough to seize it." He reached down, his hand gliding over the sharp edge of a newly forged blade. Its gleam was cold, cruel, and mesmerizing. It was the first sword humanity had ever seen, a gift from the fallen Watchers. Azazel was different in his approach. He worked in whispers, his voice coiling into the ears of those who lingered near the fires. "The stars," he said, pointing upward. "They tell stories of fate, of paths untrodden, of destinies you can shape if you understand their language." His fingers traced the air, outlining constellations as if unlocking secrets long hidden. Men, hungry for answers, leaned in closer, their eyes wide with wonder. Women, too, listened, their hands clutching the fabrics Azazel had taught them to weave with intricate patterns, colors richer and bolder than they had ever known. What they could not see was how their hearts were shifting, how the gifts of the Watchers came with invisible chains. But it was not just knowledge that the Watchers brought. It was power, raw, untamed, and too great for fragile human hands to wield without consequence. Under the guidance of the fallen, weapons were forged, not for protection but for conquest. Spears, axes, and bows became extensions of men's ambition, and the soil of the earth, once fertile, was stained with blood. The first battle began over something trivial, a dispute over land, a question of honor. The clash of metal against metal was a sound no one could forget, chilling in its finality. The cries of the wounded rose to the heavens, unanswered. But where there should have been grief, there was exhilaration. The survivors, weapon in hand, looked upon their victories not with sorrow but with pride. It was intoxicating, the feeling of power, the ability to take what had once been denied. Sorcery followed swiftly. The Watchers taught chants that twisted the air and bent it to the will of the speaker. With each whispered incantation, the boundary between the natural and the unnatural grew thinner. Women sang spells that made the skies darken, their voices carrying an eerie beauty. Men carved symbols into stone, binding forces they barely understood. The earth itself began to change, its balance disrupted, as if recoiling from what had been unleashed. In the villages, children were no longer lulled to sleep by the gentle hum of lullabies. Instead, they heard the frenzied drumming of war, the murmurs of secret rituals, and the wails of those who had been lost to newfound violence. Mothers who once cradled their babies now learned the art of poisons, their hands as steady as their hearts had become hardened. Fathers, who had once taught their sons to hunt only what was needed, now boasted of how many men they had felled in battle. The stars themselves seemed to bear witness, their lights flickering as if in protest. But Azazel's voice drowned out such warnings. "Do you see?" he asked, his arms wide as he stood atop a hill, overlooking the chaos below. "Do you see how far you've come? You are no longer bound by fear or ignorance. You are gods among men." And for a time, they believed him. They cast bronze into tools of war and sharpened their words into weapons of betrayal. The once simple lives they had lived, bound by humility and respect for the earth, seemed like distant memories. The wisdom of the Watchers, seductive and powerful, consumed them until even their dreams were filled with fire and ambition. But not all were swept away. Some huddled in the shadows, their hearts heavy with unease. They watched their neighbors, their friends, and their families transform into something they could barely recognize. The warmth that once defined their lives had been replaced by cold calculation and violent fervor. They whispered to one another of the days before the Watchers, when life was hard but pure, when the world was untainted by these terrible gifts. Shemhaza, too, began to falter. He stood apart from his brethren, watching as the villages burned and the rivers ran dark with ash. He had believed that the knowledge he offered would elevate humanity, but the cost was far greater than he had imagined. He turned to Azazel, his voice a low growl. "This is not what I wanted." Azazel only laughed, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "You wanted freedom. This is freedom. They are no longer bound by their ignorance. They are no longer weak. What do you mourn, Shemhaza? Their innocence? It was always fleeting." But Shemhaza could not shake the image of a young boy, standing by the edge of a river, clutching a sword too heavy for his small hands. The boy's eyes burned with a desire not his own, his childhood stolen by the weight of a weapon he should never have known. The corruption seeped deeper with every passing day. The earth, once a place of harmony, now groaned under the strain of humanity's endless hunger for more. Fields lay fallow, their soil exhausted. Animals, once revered and respected, were hunted not for need but for sport, their carcasses left to rot under a sun that seemed harsher than before. The stars, once a source of guidance and wonder, became tools of manipulation. Azazel's teachings turned the heavens into a weapon, their movements charted for war and dominance rather than for hope. Where once men looked up in awe, they now looked for signs of conquest, their hearts twisted by greed. And yet, the Watchers did not stop. Their pride was too great, their desire too insatiable. They had tasted the forbidden, and they could not let it go. Azazel stood atop the ruins of a village, his arms raised as he called down the power of the skies. Beside him, humanity knelt, their faces upturned, their eyes empty of anything but blind devotion. The stars above shimmered faintly, their light a final, desperate plea to a world that no longer listened. The fires below roared higher, their smoke rising like a scar into the heavens, a mark of the corruption that had taken root on the earth. And in the silence between the cries of war and the whispers of sorcery, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The sound of a child's cry pierced the stillness of the night. It wasn't the soft wail of hunger or the broken sob of exhaustion. It was a scream born of fear, raw and heart-wrenching. In the shadows of the crumbling village, a mother clutched her son to her chest, her eyes darting toward the massive figures moving through the smoke-filled streets. The Nephilim had come again, their towering forms casting monstrous silhouettes against the flickering light of burning homes. Their laughter echoed, deep and rumbling, as they trampled the small, wooden dwellings underfoot. A man stood before one of them, a crude spear in his trembling hands. "Leave us in peace," he shouted, his voice shaking. But the giant only grinned, its massive hand sweeping him aside like a dried leaf. The man's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, and the earth beneath seemed to shudder in grief. Far from the village, the rivers ran red. The Nephilim had slaughtered not only for food but for sport, their cruel games leaving trails of destruction wherever they passed. Herds of animals, once abundant, had been hunted to extinction, their lifeless bodies scattered like offerings to the insatiable greed of their tormentors. The earth, once vibrant and alive, now seemed tired, its rivers sluggish, its forests eerily silent. Humanity's spirit began to crack under the weight of suffering. Fathers wept openly in the fields as they failed to find enough grain to feed their families. Mothers, hollow-eyed and desperate, begged the heavens for mercy. But the sky remained silent, its vast expanse offering no comfort, only an overwhelming sense of abandonment. The Nephilim ruled without pity, their strength matched only by their cruelty. Villages that dared to resist were reduced to ash. The cries of those who perished rose like smoke, mingling with the groans of the earth itself. The ground trembled under their heavy footsteps, as though the very soil recoiled from their presence. Hills eroded into dust, forests withered under their shadow, and even the mountains seemed less certain, their peaks obscured by an unnatural haze. Children, who should have been laughing in sunlit meadows, now cowered in dark corners, their wide eyes reflecting terror far beyond their years. They whispered stories of the giants who ruled the land, their tales growing darker with each passing night. "They cannot be stopped," one child murmured, clutching a doll made of scraps. Another, his face streaked with tears, asked a question no one dared to answer: why did the Watchers give us monsters? In one desolate village, an elder knelt before a broken altar, his hands clutching the brittle remains of a once cherished offering. "Oh, Creator," he whispered, his voice cracking, "have you turned away from us? Have we been forgotten?" Behind him, the shattered remnants of his people gathered, their faces lined with despair. They carried nothing but their grief, their eyes fixed on the ground, too afraid to meet the gaze of the heavens. The suffering extended beyond humanity. The animals, too, bore the weight of the Nephilim's tyranny. Birds no longer sang, their melodies had been replaced by the mournful cries of beasts driven to the brink of madness. The once proud lions of the plains slinked into the shadows, their mighty roars reduced to whimpers. The forests, once alive with the hum of life, now stood silent, their leaves brittle and gray. Even the winds carried the weight of despair, their once playful gusts now cold and biting. They whispered through the desolate valleys, brushing against the broken bodies of those who had dared to hope for something better. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the world struggled to breathe under the burden of its own corruption. In the cities ruled by the Nephilim, the people toiled endlessly, their backs bent under the weight of impossible demands. The giants lounged in their makeshift thrones, carved hastily from the rubble of conquered lands. They drank wine from barrels larger than men and feasted on banquets stolen from the hands of starving families. For them, there was no consequence, no limit to their cruelty. And yet, amidst the despair, there were moments of quiet rebellion. A mother, her face lined with sorrow, wrapped a crust of bread in a torn cloth and hid it under her child's tattered cloak. "Run," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Run and don't look back." The child hesitated, tears streaming down his face, but the mother pushed him toward the shadows. He disappeared into the night, her sobs swallowed by the roar of a Nephilim's laughter. The earth itself seemed to protest, its groans growing louder with every passing day. Cracks appeared in the once solid ground, fissures that ran deep and jagged, as though the planet itself was crying out in agony. The oceans churned violently, their waves crashing against the shores with an intensity that mirrored the suffering of those who lived upon the land. One night, a small group of villagers gathered beneath a gnarled tree, its branches bare despite the season. They held hands, their voices rising in a hesitant song. It was a hymn from the old days, a prayer of gratitude and hope. The melody wavered, their voices trembling under the weight of fear, but they sang anyway. Their song was carried by the wind, rising above the ruins, a fragile thread of humanity in a world descending into chaos. The Nephilim heard the song and descended upon them. The villagers scattered, their voices silenced, their hopes trampled. Yet, for a brief moment, the sound of their hymn lingered in the air, refusing to be extinguished entirely. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. And still, the cries rose to the heavens. From every corner of the earth, from the mountains to the valleys, from the rivers to the plains, humanity called out with one voice. It was a cry of pain, of desperation, of longing. It was a plea for deliverance, for the return of light to a world drowning in shadow. Above, the stars seemed dimmer than before, as though they, too, mourned the state of the world below. The heavens held their breath, waiting. The cries of the innocent reached higher and higher, a sound so pure, so filled with anguish, that it could not be ignored forever. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the skin and makes the heart race without reason. Enoch stood at the edge of a valley, the wind curling through his hair as he gazed at the stars above. They seemed farther away than they once had, their light faint as though mourning for the earth below. His heart ached with a weight he could not fully understand, a sorrow that seemed to stretch beyond his own life, beyond the lives of his people. He knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the cool, dry earth. "Creator," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why have you given me this burden? What am I to do?" His words were carried away by the wind, and for a moment there was no answer, only the rustling of the trees and the distant cries of suffering humanity. Then it came, a light, faint at first, as if hesitant. It appeared not in the heavens, but in his mind, a warmth spreading through his chest as visions unfurled before him like the pages of an ancient book. His breath caught, and he fell forward, his hands clutching the ground as his soul was swept into something far greater than himself. He saw a world he barely recognized, consumed by shadows and chaos. Towers of smoke rose from burning cities, and the cries of the innocent echoed endlessly. The Nephilim walked the earth with arrogance, their eyes blazing with cruelty, their laughter a mockery of everything sacred. He felt the pain of the people, their despair as tangible as the ground beneath him. His chest tightened, his heart breaking with every passing moment of the vision. But then the light grew brighter, piercing through the darkness. It revealed a figure, one who stood alone, unwavering in the face of destruction. It was him. Enoch's own face stared back at him, older, wearier, yet filled with an unshakable resolve. His eyes burned with a purpose that he could not yet comprehend, but in that moment, he understood one thing: he had been chosen. The vision shifted. He saw the heavens opening, a brilliance so overwhelming it forced him to bow his head. A voice thundered, neither cruel nor gentle, but infinite and unyielding. "Enoch, son of Jared, rise." The command surged through him, pulling him to his feet. In his vision, he stood before a great throne, its radiance blinding. He felt small, unworthy, and yet the voice did not condemn him. "You have been found righteous among men. You will speak for me. You will bear witness to what is to come." His soul trembled under the weight of the words. He saw glimpses of what lay ahead, a flood of unimaginable power, cleansing the earth of its corruption. He saw the watchers, their proud faces twisted in terror as they were cast into chains. He saw the Nephilim, their towering forms crumbling into dust. And he saw humanity, broken but not destroyed, rising from the ruins to begin anew. When the vision ended, Enoch gasped for air, his body trembling. He collapsed onto the ground, his face pressed against the soil, tears streaming from his eyes. The enormity of what he had seen left him shaken, but within him, something had changed. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now a quiet determination, a flame that refused to be extinguished. In the days that followed, Enoch wandered the land, his steps guided by something greater than himself. He spoke to the people, his voice steady and sure. "Turn away from the darkness," he pleaded. "The Creator watches, and judgment is near." Some listened, their hearts stirred by his words. Others scoffed, dismissing him as a madman. But Enoch did not falter. The visions continued, each one more vivid than the last, each one a reminder of his purpose. One night, as he rested beneath an ancient tree, another vision came to him. This time, he was taken to the very edge of existence, to a place where the sky bled into the void. He stood on the precipice, staring into an abyss that seemed to stretch forever. The watchers were there, their once beautiful forms now grotesque, their eyes hollow with regret. They reached for him, their voices a cacophony of despair. "Speak for us," they begged. "Intercede on our behalf." Enoch's heart wavered. He felt their anguish, their desperation. But then he saw the consequences of their actions, the suffering they had unleashed upon the world, the lives they had destroyed. The abyss called to them, and as they were pulled into its depths, Enoch turned away, his face set with grim resolve. The visions gave him strength, but they also tormented him. Each one was a reminder of the path he was meant to walk, a path that grew darker with every step. Yet he could not deny the fire within him, the certainty that he was meant to stand against the tide of corruption. He prayed often, his words raw and unpolished, but filled with a sincerity that reached beyond the heavens. "Guide me," he begged. "Do not let me falter." As the days turned to weeks, Enoch became a beacon for those who still held on to hope. They gathered around him, drawn not by his strength, but by his unshakable faith. He spoke of the Creator's justice, of the coming reckoning, and of the promise of renewal. His words carried a weight that none could ignore, a conviction that pierced through doubt and fear. But even as he inspired others, Enoch carried the burden of his visions alone. He saw not only the judgment but the aftermath, the rebuilding, the struggles, the scars that would remain. He saw himself walking into the unknown, leaving behind everything he had ever known or loved. It terrified him, but he did not turn away. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Enoch stood atop a hill, his arms raised to the heavens. "I am yours," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the wind. "Do with me as you will." And in that moment, the stars seemed to burn brighter, their light cutting through the darkness like a promise. Enoch closed his eyes, his heart steady, his soul prepared for what lay ahead. The night air was still, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes one feel the weight of the unseen. Enoch stood outside his home, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first stars of the evening began to emerge. They twinkled faintly, their distant light offering a fragile comfort. But tonight, there was something else, something beyond the familiar quiet of the countryside. It began as a whisper in the air, a vibration that hummed through the earth and seemed to resonate within his very bones. Enoch froze, his breath catching. Then the light appeared, soft at first, but growing with an intensity that made him shield his eyes. When he dared to look again, figures emerged from the radiance, their forms unlike anything he had ever seen. They were tall, their presence commanding, yet there was no sense of menace. Their faces were serene but stern, their robes shimmering like molten silver. Enoch felt the ground beneath him tremble, not with fear, but with awe. He knew who they were without needing to ask. Angels. Messengers of the Creator. One of them stepped forward, his voice like a melody woven into the fabric of the world. "Enoch, son of Jared, rise." Enoch's knees buckled, but he obeyed, his hands trembling as he steadied himself. Why have you come to me?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The angel's gaze was steady, piercing yet compassionate. "You are summoned to the heavenly court. You must bear witness to the decree of the Most High." Before Enoch could respond, he felt his body lifted, not by hands, but by an unseen force that enveloped him. The ground fell away, and the world blurred into a cascade of light and color. He closed his eyes against the overwhelming brightness, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened them again, he was no longer on earth. He stood in a place that defied understanding. The air was alive with music, a chorus that seemed to rise and fall with the heartbeat of creation itself. Pillars of light stretched into infinity, their radiance reflecting off a floor that shimmered like polished crystal. The throne stood at the center, vast and resplendent, its brilliance too great for mortal eyes to bear. Enoch felt his legs give way, and he fell to his knees, his face pressed to the ground. The presence of the Creator was overwhelming, a power so vast and pure that it seemed to fill every corner of existence. He could not look up, could not speak, could barely breathe. The voice came then, resonant and unyielding, filling the expanse with its majesty. "Enoch, rise and stand before me." With great effort, Enoch lifted himself, his body trembling. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, for he dared not look upon the throne. "I am here, Lord," he said, his voice shaking. The Creator spoke again, each word carrying the weight of eternity. "The Watchers have defiled what I made good. They have abandoned their purpose, taken what was not theirs, and led my creation into corruption. Their offspring, the Nephilim, have brought ruin to the earth. Violence fills the land. The cries of the innocent rise to me." Enoch felt tears streaming down his face, the grief of the Creator washing over him like a tidal wave. He saw, in flashes, the devastation wrought by the Watchers and their progeny, the ruined villages, the broken families, the blood-stained earth. He felt the sorrow of the people, their despair, their longing for justice. The voice of the Creator turned to judgment, the tone unrelenting. "The Watchers are condemned. They shall be cast into the abyss, bound in chains of darkness until the day of judgment. Their offspring, the Nephilim, shall be destroyed, their legacy erased from the earth. The land shall be cleansed, and righteousness shall be restored." As the decree was spoken, Enoch saw the Watchers. Their forms, once radiant, were now twisted with despair and regret. They stood before the heavenly court, their heads bowed, their faces etched with terror. They pleaded, their voices rising in desperation, but there was no mercy in the decree. They had chosen their path, and now they would face its consequences. The angels, their faces solemn, moved to carry out the will of the Creator. Chains forged from the very essence of light and darkness were brought forth, and the Watchers were bound. Their cries echoed through the court, a chilling reminder of their fall from grace. Enoch watched, his heart heavy, but he did not look away. He understood now why he had been called, not to question, but to witness. He was a mortal, frail and finite, yet he had been chosen to see the justice of the Creator, to carry its weight back to the world below. The Nephilim appeared next, their massive forms dwarfed by the grandeur of the heavenly court. They snarled and roared, their arrogance unabated even in the face of divine judgment. But as the decree was read, their defiance faltered. They were stripped of their power, their strength crumbling like sand, until they were no more than shadows, echoes of the giants they had once been. The earth itself seemed to respond to the decree. Enoch saw mountains tremble, rivers swell, and forests sigh as though they, too, were being cleansed. The land would heal, but it would take time. Scars would remain, reminders of what had been lost. As the court grew silent, Enoch felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see one of the angels, his expression gentle but firm. "You have seen what must be done. You must carry this truth back with you. Speak it to the people. Prepare them." Before Enoch could reply, the light enveloped him once more. The heavenly court dissolved into a blur, and he felt himself descending, the weight of his task pressing heavily on his heart. When his feet touched the ground, he was back where he had started, the stars shining faintly above. But Enoch was no longer the same. He carried with him the words of the Creator, the visions of judgment and renewal. His path was clear, and though it would be fraught with challenges, he knew he would not walk it alone. The air was thick with tension, a silence heavier than words could bear. The Watchers stood in a circle, their faces pale and strained under the silver glow of the moon. Mount Hermon loomed behind them, its shadow a reminder of the oath they had sworn and the rebellion that had bound them together. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble as if the earth itself recoiled from their presence. Shemhaza stood at the center, his towering form a stark silhouette against the starlit sky. His wings, once radiant with the light of heaven, now seemed dulled, their edges frayed as if they carried the weight of his choices. He scanned the faces of his brethren, his piercing gaze locking with each of theirs in turn. "Speak," he commanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. "What is our fate to be? Will we stand, or will we fall like cowards?" The murmurs began, soft at first, like a breeze rippling through the trees, but they quickly grew louder, an avalanche of voices clashing in fear and anger. Azazel, standing to Shemhaza's right, raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. His eyes burned with defiance, a fire that seemed unquenchable even in the face of divine wrath. "Why do you tremble?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "We chose this path together. Do you regret your freedom now that it has a cost?" A voice broke through the uneasy quiet. "Freedom?" It was Serial, one of the Watchers who had been quieter since the rebellion. His face was etched with sorrow, his eyes heavy with regret. "What freedom have we gained? We are cursed. Our children, the Nephilim, wreak havoc upon the earth. They destroy everything they touch. And now we stand on the brink of destruction ourselves. This is not freedom, it is ruin." Azazel's wings flared, his expression twisting into one of scorn. "Ruin? No, it is power. The Creator would have kept us as servants, bound to His will, blind to the pleasures and wonders of the world He gave to men. We claimed what was ours by right." Shemhaza raised a hand to silence the rising argument. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the discord. "We must decide what we are to do. The decree has been made. Judgment is coming." The mention of the decree sent a shudder through the assembly. They had all felt it, the echo of divine wrath reverberating through the heavens, the certainty of their condemnation. Some bowed their heads, unable to meet the eyes of their leader. Others clenched their fists, their pride refusing to yield even now. One by one, the Watchers began to speak, their voices raw with emotion. Some, like Serial, pleaded for a chance at redemption. "Perhaps we can appeal to Enoch," he said, his voice trembling. "He is righteous in the eyes of the Creator. If he speaks for us, perhaps there is hope." "Hope?" Azazel spat, his laughter bitter and sharp. "Do you truly believe the Creator would pardon us? After all we have done? After the Nephilim have turned the earth into a battlefield? No, there is no mercy for us. We are beyond forgiveness." Another voice rose, softer, almost inaudible. It was Ramiel, who had rarely spoken since the rebellion. His words carried a deep sorrow that silenced even Azazel. "Do you not feel it?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the ground. "The weight of what we have done? The cries of the innocent, the pain we have unleashed? I hear it in my dreams. I feel it in my very being. I cannot bear it." Shemhaza's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "And what would you have us do, Ramiel? Grovel before the throne, begging for scraps of mercy? Do you think that will undo what we have wrought?" Ramiel looked up, his eyes meeting Shemhaza's with quiet resolve. "No. But perhaps it is better to accept our punishment than to defy it further. Perhaps there is dignity in facing what we have earned." Azazel stepped forward, his wings casting a shadow over Ramiel. "Coward," he hissed. "You would abandon us now, in our darkest hour? We swore an oath, Ramiel. We stood together on this mountain, and we vowed to act as one. Do you break that bond now?" Ramiel held his ground, though his voice faltered. "I do not break the bond. I speak the truth. We are broken already." The tension in the circle grew unbearable, the air thick with unspoken words. Shemhaza turned away, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. He clenched his fists, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. "We swore an oath," he said at last, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "But the oath was to one another, not to this path. I wonder, was it worth it? Azazel's eyes narrowed, his defiance unshaken. It was worth everything. I would rather burn than bow. The murmurs began again, the watchers splitting into factions. Some stood with Azazel, their pride refusing to yield, their hearts hardened against the judgment that loomed over them. Others sided with Sariel and Ramiel, their faces heavy with regret, their voices pleading for repentance. Shemhaza stood alone, caught between the two. He had led them into this rebellion, his voice the loudest on that fateful night atop Mount Hermon. But now, as he looked at the faces of his brethren, at the cracks forming in the unity they had once shared, doubt crept into his heart. He turned back to the circle, his voice rising above the chaos. "Enough," he said, and the watchers fell silent. "We are bound by what we have done. There is no turning back. But if the Creator's judgment is to come, then let us meet it as one. If we fall together." The silence that followed was deafening. The watchers exchanged glances, some filled with determination, others with despair. The stars above seemed dimmer now, as if even the heavens mourned what had been lost. The moon hung low over the earth, its silver light casting long shadows across the barren plains. Enoch sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames as they danced and flickered. His thoughts were heavy, his heart even more so. The dreams had been relentless, visions of chaos, of voices crying out in torment, of an earth fractured by violence and sin. He had prayed for clarity, for guidance, but the heavens had been silent. Now, the silence was broken. The wind stirred, and with it came a presence that sent a chill down Enoch's spine. He rose to his feet, the hem of his robe brushing against the dust. They appeared suddenly, their forms both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Watchers. Once the guardians of creation, their luminous beauty now dimmed by the weight of their rebellion. Their eyes held a strange mix of pride and desperation as they approached. Shemhaza led them, his towering figure a shadow of its former glory. His wings, tattered and darkened, rustled faintly as he stepped forward. "Enoch," he began, his voice deep and strained. "You are a man favored by God, one who walks in righteousness. We come to you not as what we once were, but as what we have become, fallen, broken." Enoch's breath caught in his throat. He could feel their sorrow, their torment, like a storm pressing against his chest. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Another voice broke through the tension, softer but trembling with emotion. It was Sariel, his face etched with regret. "We have sinned," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. "We have defied the Creator, and we have brought ruin to the earth. Our children, the Nephilim, have turned against His creation. We see now what we have done." The Watchers gathered closer, their faces pale and weary. They knelt before Enoch, their immense forms bowing low, and the sight shook him to his core. These beings, once so majestic, were now humbled, pleading. "Please," Shemhaza continued, his voice cracking. "Speak to the Most High on our behalf. Intercede for us. Perhaps He will hear you. Perhaps there is still mercy left in the heavens." Enoch's hands trembled. He stepped back, his heart racing. "Why come to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am but a man. What power do I have to change the decree of the Almighty?" Azazel, standing at the edge of the group, stepped forward, his defiance now tempered with desperation. "Because He listens to you," he said, his voice fierce but pleading. "You are His chosen. We have no voice before Him now. We are cursed, cast out, doomed. But you can stand before His throne. You can speak where we cannot." Enoch turned away, his mind a whirl of emotions. He thought of the destruction he had seen in his dreams, the blood-stained earth, the cries of the innocent. He thought of the Watchers before him, their once brilliant forms now shadows of what they had been. He thought of God's justice, unyielding and righteous, and of His mercy, deep and unfathomable. "I do not know if I can," Enoch said, his voice shaking. "What you ask is beyond me. If the Most High has decreed judgment, who am I to stand in its way?" Shemhaza rose, his expression one of anguish. "We know we deserve this," he said. We know the weight of our actions. But even the condemned cry out for mercy. Even the broken seek forgiveness. We ask not for ourselves alone, but for the world we have harmed. If there is any hope, any chance, we beg you to find it. The fire crackled, the only sound in the heavy silence that followed. Enoch's chest tightened as he looked at them, these beings who had once walked in the light, now cloaked in sorrow. He saw the regret in their eyes, the fear, the longing. And in that moment, he felt the burden of his calling more than ever before. He turned to the heavens, his gaze piercing the dark sky. If I do this, he said, his voice steadying, it is not for you alone. It is for the earth, for the people who suffer under the weight of your choices. I will speak. I will stand before the Most High. But know this, I cannot promise you what you seek. Shemhaza bowed his head, his expression unreadable. Thank you, he said, his voice barely audible. The other watchers followed suit, their wings folding in submission, their forms bowing low. As they began to fade into the shadows, Enoch felt a profound stillness settle over him. He knew the path ahead would be perilous, the weight of his task almost unbearable. But he also knew that he could not turn away. The cries of the earth, the sorrow of the fallen, and the call of the divine all pressed upon him, leaving him no choice but to act. He stood alone by the fire, the wind carrying the faint echo of the watchers' voices. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was firm. Whatever awaited him in the courts of heaven, he would face it. For the sake of the earth, for the sake of those who had no voice, he would stand. The night was still, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Enoch stood beneath the vast expanse of the stars, their brilliance more piercing than ever, as though the heavens themselves were aware of what was to come. A tremor passed through the earth, not of destruction but of anticipation, as the divine reached out to touch the mortal. A sudden, blinding light erupted before him, silencing the world in its radiance. It was not harsh, but it was overwhelming, pure in a way that no earthly flame could mimic. Enoch shielded his eyes, feeling a warmth unlike any he had known, an embrace of something infinitely vast and loving. From within the light stepped two beings, their forms shimmering, too radiant to be fully seen, yet somehow they were also gentle, their presence commanding but not frightening. Enoch, one of them spoke, the voice a harmonious blend of countless notes, resonating deep within his soul. The Most High summons you. Fear not, for you are favored. Before he could answer, the ground seemed to dissolve beneath his feet. He felt a lifting sensation, not like falling, but as if his very essence was being drawn upwards, leaving behind the weight of the world. The stars blurred into streaks of light as he ascended, the earth shrinking into a distant memory. His body tingled with an unfamiliar energy, as though the very fibers of his being were transforming to endure what lay ahead. The light around him intensified until it was all he could see, an infinite expanse of brilliance. Then, as suddenly as it had engulfed him, it softened, revealing a realm that words could scarcely describe. Enoch gasped, his breath catching at the sheer majesty before him. The skies were alive with hues that had no name, shifting and flowing like a living canvas. Towers of crystalline light reached into infinity, their surfaces shimmering with reflections of all creation. Angelic beings filled the space, each unique, their forms radiating a power and beauty that made Enoch tremble. Some were vast, their wings stretching out like clouds of fire and light, their voices a constant hum of praise that resonated through the very air. Others were smaller but no less glorious, their faces serene, their movements precise and purposeful. Their presence was overwhelming, yet their eyes held a warmth that stilled Enoch's fears. The angels escorted him through this celestial expanse, their every step producing melodies that wove into the air. Enoch struggled to take it all in, each sight more breathtaking than the last. He passed rivers of light that sparkled like countless jewels, their currents whispering ancient truths. Trees stood rooted in glowing soil, their leaves gleaming like molten gold. A breeze passed, carrying with it a fragrance so pure it brought tears to his eyes. In the distance, Enoch saw thrones of unimaginable grandeur, set in perfect harmony. Surrounding them were angels whose forms defied comprehension, their bodies woven from flame, their faces obscured by shifting veils of light. They stood as sentinels, their voices raised in chants of reverence that filled the air with an almost unbearable beauty. As he approached, he felt his mortal frame struggle against the weight of this holiness. His knees buckled, his heart racing, yet unseen hands seemed to hold him steady. He understood, in a way that needed no words, that he stood before something beyond the comprehension of flesh and blood. Finally, he was brought before a great hall, its entrance flanked by beings whose presence alone could crush mountains. The air vibrated with a sacred energy, the intensity growing with each step. The angels guiding him stopped and motioned for him to continue alone. Enoch hesitated, his breath shallow, but he felt an unseen force urging him forward. He stepped into the hall and froze. Before him was a throne of incomprehensible brilliance, the source of all light and life. Around it swirled a storm of fire and radiance, a presence so vast that it seemed to encompass everything. Enoch could not lift his eyes fully, for even a glimpse was enough to overwhelm his senses. He fell to his knees, his face pressed against the shimmering floor, his body trembling with awe. The voice that spoke then was unlike any other. It was not sound, but a resonance that filled every part of him, a voice that was both the roar of thunder and the gentlest whisper. "Enoch, my servant," it said, and the words carried a weight that felt like the foundation of existence itself. "Why have the Watchers sent you here?" Tears streamed down Enoch's face as he tried to form words. His voice trembled, barely audible. They plead for mercy. They know they have sinned, that they have brought ruin to the earth. They seek forgiveness, though they know they deserve judgment. The light around the throne flared, and Enoch felt its power like the rising of an unrelenting tide. Their sins have reached the heavens. They have corrupted my creation, spilling blood, defying my will. The cries of the innocent have risen to me, and my judgment is just. Enoch's heart sank, the weight of those words crushing his spirit. Yet he found himself speaking, his voice faint but resolute. "O Most High, you are just in all your ways. Yet your mercy is as boundless as your might. If it pleases you, grant me the courage to carry your word, that it may be known among the fallen and the faithful alike." The silence that followed was immense, stretching beyond time itself. Then, the presence softened, as though acknowledging the burden Enoch carried. "Rise, Enoch," the voice said. "You will be the bearer of my decree. Speak to the Watchers and their offspring of what is to come. Tell them of their fate, and let the earth know that I am the Lord." Enoch felt himself lifted, his body filled with a peace that soothed his trembling frame. He rose to his feet, still unable to fully gaze upon the throne, but no longer paralyzed by fear. The angels returned, surrounding him, their faces serene as they prepared to guide him back. As he was led away, Enoch dared to glance back, his eyes catching the faintest glimpse of the throne's radiance. It was a sight that seared into his soul, a reminder of both the justice and mercy of the Creator. The halls of heaven faded, and once more, Enoch felt himself being carried through the realms, the light giving way to the familiar darkness of the night. When his feet touched the earth again, the stars above seemed brighter, their light a quiet echo of the glory he had witnessed. Enoch stood in the stillness, his heart heavy yet resolute, the words of the Most High burning within him like a sacred flame. The sky above seemed impossibly vast, a shimmering dome alive with stars that pulsed like the very heartbeat of creation. Enoch stood at the edge of the ethereal court, his breath caught in his chest. The weight of his task pressed on him like a great stone, yet he felt the faintest touch of reassurance, a whisper in his soul that he was not alone. The angels who had escorted him parted in reverence as he stepped forward. Before him loomed the throne of judgment, its light brighter than any sun, yet it did not burn. It emanated a justice so pure that it filled Enoch with awe and fear in equal measure. Surrounding the throne, an innumerable host of angels stood motionless, their forms glowing, their faces veiled by the brilliance. The air itself seemed to sing with their presence, a hymn of holy anticipation. Enoch knelt, his forehead touching the translucent ground that shimmered beneath him. Every part of him trembled, not just his body, but his very soul, aware of the majesty he faced. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice faltered. What words could a mortal bring before the Creator of all things? The silence of the court enveloped him, vast and infinite. Then it came, a voice that was both thunder and whisper, filling every corner of existence. "Enoch, my servant, rise and speak. What have the watchers to say?" The command lifted Enoch like a gentle wind. He stood, his knees weak but his resolve firm. The watchers' plea weighed heavy on his heart, and their faces flashed before his eyes, some defiant, others hollow with regret. Their voices had filled his ears with desperation, their guilt laid bare in their petition. He drew a breath and began. "O Most High, I come with the words of those who have transgressed against you. They confess their rebellion, their sin that has brought ruin to the earth. They cry out for mercy, though they know they are unworthy of it. They plead for forgiveness, not for themselves alone, but for the sake of what they once were, your servants, made to watch and protect." His voice faltered for a moment, but he pushed on. "They acknowledge their fall, and they weep for the destruction they have caused. Yet they hope, though faintly, that your boundless mercy might reach even them." The air seemed to grow heavier, the light around the throne intensifying. Enoch felt it like a great wave, a force both vast and sorrowful. The silence that followed his words was like the pause before a storm, filled with the weight of judgment. At last, the voice spoke again, and it was firm, unyielding. "The watchers have defied their purpose. They abandoned their charge, sought dominion over what was not theirs, and corrupted my creation. Their knowledge, given to aid humanity, was twisted into tools of war, suffering, and destruction. They have spilled innocent blood and brought chaos to the world I formed in love." The words struck Enoch like blows, yet he remained standing, his head bowed. "Their children, the Nephilim, are an abomination, their existence a stain upon the earth. They have filled the world with violence and silenced the cries of the righteous. My judgment cannot be swayed, for it is just." Enoch's heart sank, the finality of the words ringing through him. But the voice continued, and this time, it held a note of sorrow that pierced even deeper. "For humanity, there will be mercy. Though they were led astray, though their hands are stained with sin, they are still the work of my hands, formed in my image. They will not be abandoned. A cleansing will come, and the earth will be renewed. Those who turn to righteousness will find refuge in me." The throne's light dimmed slightly, and Enoch felt a shift, as though the weight of God's gaze now rested fully upon him. "You, Enoch, are chosen to bear this message. Speak to the watchers of their fate. Tell them their plea has been heard but cannot be granted. They will be bound, their power stripped, until the day of the great judgment." A tremor ran through Enoch at these words, not from fear, but from the immense sadness they carried. The watchers, once glorious beings of light, would face an eternity of separation from the source of all goodness and life. Their rebellion had severed them from the Creator, and now the consequences would be eternal. The voice softened, though its authority remained undiminished. "Go now, my servant. You have seen my justice and my mercy. Speak what you have heard, and let it be known that I am the Lord, unchanging and true." Enoch bowed deeply, his face wet with tears. He could feel the sorrow of heaven, the grief for what had been lost. The watchers were not forgotten, even in their condemnation. There was no hatred, only the pain of a Creator whose children had chosen to turn away. As he rose, the angels who had escorted him reappeared, their faces serene but solemn. They surrounded him once more, their forms shimmering as they prepared to return him to the world below. As they began to move, Enoch glanced back at the throne, its light now a steady glow that seemed to pulse with life itself. He could not look for long, but in that brief moment, he felt something he could not fully understand, a mixture of immeasurable love and unshakable righteousness. The descent was swift, the celestial court fading into the distance until Enoch stood once more upon the earth. The night was quiet, the stars watching silently, as if they too bore witness to what had transpired. Enoch's heart was heavy, his mind racing with the words he had heard, the task he had been given. The watchers would await his return, their hopes fragile but alive. He gazed at the heavens, his soul filled with awe and sorrow, the weight of both justice and mercy resting upon him. The air was thick with a silence so deep it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Enoch stood at the edge of the earth, looking out into the vast horizon where the sky met the land. A strange chill had settled over him, one that wasn't born of the evening breeze, but from something deeper, something far older than the winds themselves. He felt it rising within him, a tremor in his soul, as though the earth beneath his feet were quaking with the weight of a future yet to come. Without warning, the world around him began to change. The stars, once a peaceful scattering across the sky, darkened. The moon dimmed, its light growing faint as if it too had lost hope. Enoch's vision blurred, his senses stretched thin as he was lifted beyond his own body, carried into a place that was both timeless and fleeting. The first vision came to him like a flash, brilliant, terrible, and undeniable. He saw it then, the great flood. The waters surged like an unstoppable tide, swallowing everything in their path. There was no mercy in that wave, no reprieve. It was a force of nature so powerful that it seemed to erase the very foundations of the world. Enoch could feel the terror in the hearts of those who would be swept away, could hear the cries that echoed from every corner of the earth. The Nephilim, those monstrous offspring of the fallen angels, were there, towering above the land. Their shadows stretched across the earth, dark and terrifying, as they loomed over the terrified people. But even as they stood, proud and defiant, they were unaware of the doom that was rapidly closing in. The flood would come for them, too. Enoch felt a sharp pang in his chest as he watched the floodwaters rise, drowning the wicked giants in their wake. The Nephilim fought, some scrambling for footholds that didn't exist, others roaring in fury at the heavens, cursing the very existence of their fate. Yet, no matter how powerful they were, no matter how high they climbed, they could not escape the rising tide. The water came for them, swallowing their massive forms whole. It was then that Enoch heard the voice, soft but filled with sorrow. This is the fate of those who have strayed from the path. The flood is a cleansing, a purging of what has grown too dark. The vision shifted. No longer was he standing on the earth, but within the very depths of the abyss itself. Enoch's heart faltered as he saw the Watchers, the fallen angels who had once watched over humanity, now bound in chains of fiery light. Their wings, once so grand, were now shredded and broken, their bodies twisted and writhing in eternal torment. The once glorious beings of light had become nothing more than shadows, imprisoned in a place of endless suffering. Enoch could feel their pain. Their screams were not of physical agony, but of a deep, existential anguish, a knowledge that they had chosen their own fate. Each one of them, once a servant of the Creator, now faced an eternity of torment, separated from the very light that had once given them purpose. As his vision pulled back, Enoch saw the Watchers, still bound and trapped in that dark place. There was no escape for them. No redemption. They would remain in that prison, not for a single lifetime, but for eternity, cut off from the mercy of the Creator, never again to feel the warmth of forgiveness or the peace of grace. The punishment was as eternal as the stars, a reminder of the consequences of their rebellion. But the sorrow Enoch felt for them did not compare to the sorrow that weighed on his heart as he saw the world below. The flood, it seemed, had not just washed away the Nephilim, it had wiped away the darkness, leaving behind only a purified earth, ready to be reborn. Yet, even in the aftermath, there was something deeply painful about the emptiness left behind. The flood had been necessary, but the cost was great. The loss of innocence, the destruction of life, it was a price that could never be undone. Enoch fell to his knees as the visions swirled around him. He could hear the cries of the lost, the voices of the innocent who had perished in the chaos, their lives snuffed out by the sins of the fallen. He could feel their sorrow, their confusion, as they had been caught in the crossfire of a cosmic battle. The very earth seemed to mourn with them, its soil rich with the weight of grief. But as the visions grew darker, a new image appeared in the distance. It was a flicker at first, a glimmer of light in the midst of the shadows. It grew brighter, pulsing with an undeniable force, until it was all Enoch could see. A single figure stood in that light, tall and radiant, their presence like a beacon in the midst of the chaos. And though Enoch could not fully comprehend it, he knew that this figure was the key, the one who would stand as the final judge over all things, the one who would bring both justice and mercy. The vision of the end times, of the flood and the Watcher's eternal punishment, hung before him like a tapestry woven from both grief and hope. The earth would be cleansed, yes, but the consequences of the Watcher's actions would echo through the ages. The seeds of their rebellion had grown into something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, and the world would bear the scars forever. Enoch's heart pounded as he saw the final moments of the Watcher's fate. They would not be forgotten. Even in the abyss, their names would be remembered for all time, and their punishment would be the story told to every generation that came after. It would be a warning, a reminder of what happens when one chooses to defy the Creator. With the last of his visions fading, Enoch was left standing on the precipice of the unknown, his soul heavy with the weight of the future. He had seen the flood, the punishment, and the ultimate price of rebellion. There was no turning back now. The world would change, and with it, the lives of all those who remained would be shaped by the legacy of the Watcher's fall. The silence that followed was deafening, and Enoch felt it in the deepest parts of his soul, a silence that could only mean one thing. Judgment was coming. Azazel stood at the edge of the abyss, his dark wings stretching wide, casting long shadows across the barren land. The winds howled, but they did not touch him. His defiance was a force of nature itself, something that no storm or tide could ever shake. The earth seemed to tremble in response, not with fear, but with the raw, unyielding force of his anger. The ground beneath his feet felt like a thin veil between him and the eternity of darkness awaiting him. He had heard the voices of the other Watchers, the voices of those who had once stood by his side, their souls broken and weary, pleading for mercy. But mercy, Azazel believed, was a concept for the weak. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, looked up at the heavens, his gaze unflinching. The Creator had turned his back on them, cast them down into this pit of their own making. Azazel would never ask for forgiveness, never bow to a higher will that had failed them all. The others, they were weaker. The shame of what they had done, the betrayal of their own kind, had consumed them. But not Azazel. He had seen the truth. He had tasted the freedom that defied the boundaries of the heavens, and he would not let it slip away. He would not beg for mercy from a Creator who had abandoned them. The sky, once so clear and pure, now seemed like a distant memory. The pale light of the stars flickered dimly above him. He felt no comfort in their glow, no solace from their cold light. Instead, he reveled in the dark emptiness, where he was the master of his own fate. The others, the ones who had been with him in the beginning, would never understand. They would beg, they would plead, and in the end, they would fall into the same despair that had overtaken them all. But Azazel, he had made his choice. He had been the one to teach humanity the arts of war, of power, of rebellion. The forbidden knowledge he had shared was his mark on the world, a world he had helped shape with his own hands. They had learned from him, they had become like him. He had shown them how to bend the rules, how to fight for their own desires, how to cast aside the chains of heaven. Now, even in the face of their inevitable punishment, Azazel refused to back down. He had tasted that power, and nothing could make him give it up. Not the Creator's wrath, not the punishment that was surely coming. The others, the weaker ones, they feared what was to come. They feared the flood, the punishment, the abyss. But Azazel felt no fear. His heart was empty, hollow, free. As the days passed, the divide among the fallen deepened. Those who had once been brothers and sisters in rebellion began to look at each other with suspicion and doubt. The weight of their actions had pressed down on them in ways Azazel could not fully understand. Some began to speak of repentance, of pleading for mercy, of seeking a way to redeem themselves. It sickened him. Their weakness was unbearable. The other Watchers had begun to see their errors, their fall from grace, and in their shame, they sought forgiveness. They turned to Enoch, the one chosen by the Creator to be their messenger, and begged him to intercede on their behalf. They wanted to believe that they could undo what they had done, that they could turn back the hands of time and find some way to regain their place in the heavens. But Azazel would have none of it. He watched as the others fell to their knees, crying out to the Creator for mercy. The sight only deepened his contempt. How could they be so weak? How could they still believe that there was hope for them? The rebellion had been his choice, and he would stand by it, no matter the cost. His refusal to repent became a dark flame that burned between him and the others. They could not understand him, could not fathom the strength in his defiance. And they began to fear him for it. There were whispers in the darkness. The watchers began to pull away from him, unable to reconcile their own guilt with his unshakable resolve. They did not know what to make of Azazel anymore. He was a riddle to them, a broken puzzle that could never be solved. Azazel felt the shift, the coldness that spread like an invisible barrier between him and those he had once called his allies. Their fear was like a wall, cold and unyielding, and he stood on the other side, unbothered by it. In their eyes, he had become something monstrous. In his own eyes, he had become everything they had feared to be. But he didn't care. With every passing moment, Azazel's anger grew deeper, his resolve harder. He had made his choice. He had embraced the darkness, and he would never turn back. The Creator's judgment was inevitable, but Azazel would not submit. He would never kneel before the same forces that had cast him down. The others, they were broken. They had been consumed by their regret. But Azazel was different. He had never needed the forgiveness they sought. And so, he stood alone in his defiance, feeling the pull of the abyss beneath him, feeling the weight of his own rebellion. He had no illusions about what awaited him. He knew the consequences. But none of that mattered. As the days stretched on, the watchers grew increasingly divided. Some of them, the ones who still clung to the hope of mercy, began to hate Azazel for his refusal to relent. Their shame had become their chains, and Azazel's unrepentant defiance only reminded them of the consequences they had yet to face. Their anger towards him began to burn, just as his own anger burned brighter with every passing moment. The divide was irreversible now. The watchers were no longer united. They were splintered, and Azazel, the most defiant among them, had become the symbol of everything they feared to be. They had once shared a bond of rebellion, but now, that bond had been shattered, torn apart by their own regrets and Azazel's unyielding pride. And Azazel, standing in the heart of it all, felt the cold emptiness of his soul. It didn't matter what they thought of him anymore. He had made his choice. And as the world began to move toward its inevitable end, Azazel would face his fate alone, a defiant figure against the coming storm. The room was quiet, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. Enoch sat alone at a simple wooden table, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the quill. Before him lay a set of sacred tablets, smooth and cold, waiting to be marked. The weight of what he was about to write pressed heavily on his chest, a burden that felt almost unbearable. The judgment that had been declared was final. It was not just for the watchers or their monstrous children, it was for the world itself, for all of creation. His heart ached, and yet he knew there was no other choice but to write the truth. The ink was dark and thick, gliding onto the surface of the tablets with each careful stroke. Enoch's eyes, filled with both sorrow and resolve, never left the surface as he began to write. He could almost feel the presence of the Almighty in the room, the weight of divine wrath hanging heavy in the silence. His hand moved of its own accord, as if the words were being dictated to him from somewhere far beyond this world. His fingers felt numb, but his spirit burned with the certainty that what he wrote was the only way forward. It was as if the Creator's will flowed through him, through his very bones, compelling him to record the inevitable. The judgment was clear. The watchers, the angels who had once walked the earth with such grandeur, had defiled themselves and humanity. Their punishment would be a fate worse than death. Their deeds had corrupted the world, and now the earth would swallow them whole. Their rebellion would not go unanswered. As Enoch wrote the decrees, the words felt as though they burned on the tablets, their weight like iron shackles that would bind the fallen forever. He paused for a moment, his hand hovering above the surface, his breath shaky. A vision flashed before his eyes, visions of the Nephilim, the giants who had once roamed freely upon the earth, now crumbling into nothingness. Their prideful, violent ways had brought ruin upon the world, and now they would be swept away by the cleansing flood that was to come. Enoch could almost hear the cries of the innocent who had been lost, their suffering echoing in the corners of his soul. His heart twisted with the pain of what was coming, but he knew there was no other way. The flood would wash away the wickedness, the stain left by the fallen ones, and give the earth a chance to begin anew. The sacred tablets began to fill with the words of prophecy, words that would echo through the ages, carried by the winds of time. As Enoch continued to write, he could feel the coldness of fate creeping into his veins. It was not just a message to the fallen, but to all generations to come. It was a warning, a promise that the consequences of sin would not be forgotten, that the earth itself would cry out for justice. The writing was slow and deliberate, each word etched into the stone like a hammer striking an anvil. Enoch's hand ached with each stroke, but he did not stop. There was no turning back now. The words had to be written. The prophecy of the flood, the destruction of the Nephilim, the judgment upon the watchers, it was all there, laid out in stark clarity. As he wrote, Enoch's thoughts wandered briefly to his own family, to the ones he loved. He could not save them from the coming storm, but perhaps these words, these tablets, would be their legacy. A warning, etched into eternity, that they too might one day find salvation. He finished the final strokes, his quill trembling in his hand as the last word was written. The tablets were complete. The prophecy was set in stone. Enoch let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his chest tightening with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The silence in the room was deafening now. He stood, stepping back from the table, and for a moment, he simply stared at the tablets. The weight of what he had just created was almost too much to bear. These tablets would not only serve as a record of the judgment upon the watchers, but also as a warning to those who would come after. It was a truth that no one would be able to deny, a truth that would live long after his own days on earth had passed. In the days to come, when the flood had come and gone, when the earth had been purged of its corruption, these tablets would stand as a testament to what had been. They would be remembered by the generations that would arise from the survivors, those who would inherit the earth after its cleansing. Enoch took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the task that had been laid before him. He knew that the fate of the watchers had been sealed, but what of humanity? What of the ones who had been led astray? Would they, too, suffer the consequences of their actions? Would they, like the watchers, face their own judgment? Enoch's heart was torn between the love he felt for the children of men and the cold reality of the world's decay. He had no answers, no certainty. He only had the tablets before him, the prophecy that would shape the future of all living things. With a final, lingering glance at the tablets, Enoch carefully placed them in a safe place, hidden from the world for now. He knew that one day, they would be uncovered. One day, they would be read. And when that day came, the world would remember. The words would stand as a stark reminder of the price of disobedience, the cost of pride, the weight of rebellion. The world would not forget the warning that had been left for them, the prophecy that would echo down through the centuries. As Enoch walked away from the tablets, the room seemed to grow colder. The weight of the future hung heavy in the air, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of thunder, like the earth itself mourning the fate of those who had chosen to fall. Enoch's heart ached with the knowledge that the flood was coming, and that nothing, not even the sacred tablets, could stop it. The earth trembled beneath the weight of sin, the land soaked with the violence and corruption of the Nephilim. Their presence grew darker, more oppressive with every passing day. These monstrous offspring of the Watchers rampaged across the earth, their thirst for power and destruction never satisfied. The once beautiful world had become a battlefield, torn apart by the fury of beings too strong and too prideful to see their own decay. And as they wreaked havoc, the cries of the innocent filled the air, rising like smoke, piercing the heavens themselves. Enoch could feel the pain of it all in his bones, the suffocating weight of the earth's anguish. The earth groaned, as if it, too, was begging for relief, for the coming end of its torment. The animals scattered in fear, the skies turned dark, and the rivers ran with blood. It was clear to all who could see that the time of reckoning had come. Enoch's heart ached with a sorrow deeper than words could capture. It was a sorrow not just for the innocent lives lost, but for the fallen themselves. The watchers who had once been so high and mighty now lay at the center of the storm they had unleashed, too proud to ask for forgiveness. And yet, the judgment had been set in motion. God, in his justice, would not allow the world to drown in this sin. The flood was coming, the great cleansing. The earth would be washed, and only the pure would remain. Enoch's voice, though filled with a terrible sense of urgency, would be the last warning. The flood would come. It was no longer a question, but a certainty. One man, Noah, stood at the center of this divine plan, the lone man spared from the destruction that was about to come. Enoch had sought him out, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the warning he carried. He found Noah where the land met the trees, his face lined with concern and confusion. Noah had been hearing whispers of the coming disaster for some time, but he had not yet fully understood its scope. Now, standing before Enoch, his heart seemed to shudder as he listened to the words that would change everything. The flood. The destruction of the Nephilim. The end of the world as it was known. Enoch spoke with a voice as heavy as the sky, his words clear but filled with an aching sorrow. He told Noah that the flood would soon come, that God's wrath would wash over the earth, sparing only those who followed his command. The time to build was now. The ark, Noah's ark, was the only chance for survival. Noah's eyes widened, his hands trembling as the weight of the task before him sank in. To build such a massive vessel, to prepare for a flood that would drown the world, it was unimaginable. He could feel the cold, biting wind of doubt rush through him, mingling with the uncertainty of what this message meant for his life, for his family, for all he knew. But deep down, a quiet voice told him to trust. Enoch's words were not empty. The flood was coming, and there was no turning back. The sound of hammering began soon after. With each strike of the nail, Noah built the ark. It was an act of obedience, but also an act of faith. He didn't understand everything, he didn't know how or why God's judgment had to come in such a way, but he knew that his trust in the divine plan was the only way forward. As the massive structure took shape, Noah's heart began to soften, his doubts starting to fade into the rhythm of the work. There was no turning back. There was only the ark, and the knowledge that it was the only safe place in a world that had gone mad. The Nephilim's destruction continued. The beasts of the earth grew more restless, the air heavy with the promise of an end to all things. Yet Noah worked, his hands blistering from the hard labor, his soul steeled by the knowledge that this was the only way to save his family, his children. Every day he looked up to the sky, feeling its weight growing heavier, sensing the storm that would soon swallow everything whole. The world outside seemed to darken with each passing moment, the winds howling as if the very earth knew its time was running out. Inside the walls of the ark, there would be safety. But outside, there was chaos. The days grew longer, and with them, the sounds of violence and destruction filled the air. The Nephilim were everywhere, towering, powerful, and unstoppable in their hunger for more. The creatures they had once ruled now turned on them, their fury awakening as if to mirror the judgment that was drawing near. The floodwaters had not yet risen, but the land had already begun to drown in blood and anguish. Noah's work continued. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, the hopelessness of the world outside growing with every hammer strike. But with every nail that went in, with every plank of wood that was added to the ark's frame, he felt a small measure of peace. This, at least, he could do. This was his task, and he would see it through, no matter what. The day came when the ark was complete. Noah stood back, gazing at the massive structure that had taken so much time and effort. It was his salvation. It was the salvation of the few who had listened, the handful who had believed. But the world outside, those who had refused to heed the warning, who had turned away from the message of judgment, would not be saved. They would be swallowed by the flood. The waters would rise, and the earth would be cleansed of its sin. Noah turned to Enoch, who stood nearby, his face shadowed by the weight of what was to come. The two men shared a quiet look, one that held more than words could say. Enoch knew what Noah had just completed. He knew the weight of it, the cost of salvation. And as the final day drew near, he offered a silent prayer, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the destruction that would soon unfold. The flood was coming, and there was no escaping it. The storm, the judgment, it would sweep away everything. But for Noah, for his family, there was hope. In the midst of destruction, there was the ark. And it was there that the future would be rewritten. The last chance for salvation had arrived, and all that was left was to wait for the rain to fall. The flood was coming, and nothing could stop it. The moment was heavy with the weight of divine justice, as the heavens stirred with a trembling anticipation. The world, already shaking from the echoes of the flood, felt another tremor, one that came from the very heart of the divine court. The watchers had gone too far. Their defiance, their rebellion, their very existence had been an affront to God's order. And now, the time had come for them to face the consequences of their actions. In an instant, the sky above the earth darkened, not with the clouds of a passing storm, but with the presence of something far more powerful. A brightness that was not of the sun, nor of the stars, but pure and blinding, cut through the darkness. The archangels descended, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. Each one came with a purpose that was as ancient as time itself. Their power was beyond comprehension, their authority unquestionable. They were the executors of divine will, the instruments of judgment that had been called to act. Michael, the warrior, his eyes like burning coals, stood first. His sword gleamed with a light that could blind even the strongest of the fallen. Gabriel, the herald of truth, her wings spreading like a great banner, radiated the message of God's wrath. Raphael, the healer, with a sadness that seemed to run deep in his soul, prepared to bind and bind again, knowing the price of healing was often pain. And Uriel, the angel of wisdom, whose presence was like a deep well of knowledge, stood with a calm that only comes from knowing that justice must be done. Together, they moved with purpose, their forms like lightning, swift and unyielding. The watchers, who had once stood proud and tall, now trembled beneath the gaze of the divine hosts. They had once walked the earth, their power undeniable. But now, their time was up. The first to be bound was Azazel, the leader of the watchers. His heart, filled with such defiance, had led others astray. He had taught humanity the forbidden arts, weaponry, sorcery, secrets that should have never been known to men. And now, the price was to be paid. Michael's gaze locked on Azazel, and the air seemed to grow cold around them. Azazel's arrogance faltered for the first time, but there was no mercy left in his fate. With a single motion, Michael cast him into a desert abyss, a place so dark, so empty, that even his immortal eyes could not pierce the blackness. It was a place of eternal silence, where the screams of the fallen would never be heard, where time itself seemed to stand still. Azazel was left to wander in the endless emptiness, forever cut off from the light, from the world he had once known. The others watched, their fear slowly creeping in as they realized their fate was sealed. They had followed Azazel's lead, and now they, too, would pay the price. Gabriel's wings flared as she approached, her eyes full of pity and sorrow, but also an unyielding resolve. The remaining watchers, those who had been deceived by Azazel's promises of power and freedom, were chained in darkness. Their chains were not made of metal, but of the very forces of creation, unbreakable, eternal. Raphael stepped forward, his heart heavy, his gaze sad as he moved toward the fallen angels. He did not wish to cause pain, but the duty was clear. He wrapped his hands around the chains, pulling the watchers into their eternal prison. They struggled, their cries echoing into the void, but there was no escape. They were locked in a prison not of this world, a place where even the fiercest of their wills would break, where the weight of their choices would crush them. Uriel stood by, his face unreadable. He had seen this before, and he knew that these angels would never know peace again. The rebellion had been too great, the betrayal too deep. The watchers had once stood with God, but they had chosen to fall, and now they would feel the full force of that choice. As the last of the watchers was chained and taken into the darkness, the heavens sighed. It was not a sigh of triumph, nor of relief, but a sigh of the terrible weight of justice. The punishment had been delivered, but there was no joy in it. For even in their rebellion, even in their sin, the watchers had been beautiful. They had been created for greatness, and now, to see them fall so completely was a heartbreak that rippled through the divine court. The earth, once again, was left to stand in the silence that followed. The presence of the archangels remained for a moment longer, a final reminder that the balance of creation had been restored. But even as the heavenly hosts retreated, their wings fading into the heavens, the earth itself seemed to mourn. For it had not only lost its guardians, but the whispers of their defiance would echo for eternity. The punishment of the Watchers was not just a judgment on them, it was a warning to all who would dare to defy the natural order. The heavens had spoken, and no one, not even the mightiest, could escape the consequences of their choices. Azazel and his followers were bound, their fate sealed. The desert abyss awaited him, a prison where no sound could escape, where no hope could reach. The others, chained in eternal darkness, would never again know the touch of light. The silence of their imprisonment would echo through the ages, a reminder of the cost of their pride. And as the last of the angels faded from sight, the earth was left in its solitude. The Nephilim, their monstrous descendants, would soon face their own end. The flood had come, and with it, the cleansing that the earth so desperately needed. The Watchers were no more. Their rebellion, their sins, had been judged. And now, all that was left was the silence of their fall. A silence that would never be broken. The earth trembled beneath the weight of war. The sky, once a canvas of light and hope, now darkened with the smoke of burning villages and the cries of the fallen. A cataclysm was upon the land, one that had been years in the making. The Nephilim, towering giants born of forbidden unions, roamed the earth with a hunger that was as vast as their size. The humans, fragile but desperate, had nowhere to run. The very air seemed to crackle with the sound of their struggle, a battle that no one could win. The Nephilim were unstoppable. Their massive forms crushed everything in their path, their eyes gleaming with a cold, unfeeling malice. They had no mercy for the people of the earth, those who had once been their kin, the children of their fallen fathers. The humans, armed with nothing but crude weapons and hearts full of defiance, fought back. But it was hopeless. No spear, no sword, no shield could pierce the thick skin of the giants. The earth was their battleground, the cries of the innocent drowned beneath the heavy march of the Nephilim's feet. The land that had once been so full of life now lay in ruins. Cities crumbled, forests were scorched, rivers ran red with the blood of those who had dared to resist. The giants were relentless, their strength unyielding. The humans, broken and scattered, could only run, hiding in caves and distant corners of the earth, hoping against hope that they would survive another day. But even as the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, there was still a glimmer of hope. In the midst of the chaos, a voice rose, soft at first, then louder, stronger, a warning that echoed across the earth. It was Enoch, the righteous man, the one who had seen the coming of the flood. He had spoken of it before, of the cleansing that would come, and now, as the Nephilim rampaged, his words took on a new meaning. The flood was coming, and it would wash away the horrors that had been wrought by the giants. Noah, a man chosen by God, took up the task that had been set before him. He began to build the ark, the vessel that would carry the hope of humanity through the coming storm. The rain would fall, the waters would rise, and everything the Nephilim had destroyed would be swallowed by the depths. The earth would be cleansed, and the giants who had once ruled would be washed away, their reign brought to an end. As the ark took shape, so too did the final days of the Nephilim. Their power, once so immense, now seemed to wane as the floodwaters began to rise. The giants had no understanding of what was coming. They had terrorized the world for so long that they believed nothing could stop them. But the flood, the cleansing wrath of God, was relentless. It knew no mercy. It swept across the earth, washing away the devastation left by the Nephilim's war. The giants, so mighty in their strength, now found themselves powerless before the waters. They roared in fury, their voices drowned by the crashing waves that engulfed them. The earth shook as the floodwaters rose higher and higher, swallowing everything in their path. No mountain could shield them. No valley could hide them. The flood came, and with it, the final destruction of the Nephilim. One by one, the giants fell. Some tried to flee, but the waters were too quick, too fierce. Their massive bodies were swept away, carried off by the tide, their cries fading into the roar of the storm. The earth, once their playground, was now their tomb. In the end, there was no trace left of them. The Nephilim, who had once ruled the land with terror, were gone, their legacy erased by the very flood that had been foretold. And yet, in the aftermath of their fall, there was a strange silence. The floodwaters receded, and the land that had been so scarred by the Nephilim's rampage was left in a state of mourning. The earth had been cleansed, yes, but at what cost? The humans who had survived the flood, the ones who had fought so hard to stay alive, now stood in the ruins of a world that had been torn apart. The giants were gone, but the scars they had left behind would never fully heal. The memory of the Nephilim's destruction lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the violence and chaos that had once ruled the earth. And yet, there was also a sense of peace, an uneasy peace, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. The flood had come, and with it, the end of an era. The Nephilim, for all their strength, had been brought low by the very waters that had once cleansed the earth. As the survivors of the flood began to rebuild, they knew that the world would never be the same. The giants were gone, but their legacy lived on in the stories that would be told for generations. The flood had washed away the horrors they had wrought, but it had also left behind a deep sorrow, a sorrow for the lives lost, for the families torn apart, and for the world that would never be as it once was. The Nephilim, with all their power, had been destroyed. But their memory would live on, a warning to all who would seek to repeat their mistakes. Their reign had been brief, but their impact was eternal. And as the survivors looked to the future, they could only wonder, would humanity, given the chance, repeat the same mistakes? Or would they learn from the past, from the fall of the Nephilim, and strive to build a world free from the horrors of old? The flood had come. The giants had fallen. And now, all that was left was silence, and the hope that such a darkness would never return. Enoch's feet had long since ceased to touch the earth. The air around him seemed to tremble, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. He stood at the precipice of something no mortal had ever witnessed, and perhaps no mortal ever would again. The world he had known, the world of struggle, sorrow, and prophecy, was slipping away from him, like sand through fingers. Yet, despite the magnitude of what was happening, he did not fear. He had lived his life in service, in righteousness, and now, in this final moment, there was peace. He looked up, towards the sky, the very heavens that had once seemed so distant now so close. The clouds parted before him like a curtain, revealing the golden light that shone from above. The air grew thick with a sense of something profound, something beyond words. A great voice called out to him, a voice that filled the air with power, with grace. It was God, calling him home. Without a word, Enoch began to rise. His feet lifted from the ground, and the earth below him seemed to let him go with a gentle sorrow. He had served his purpose, fulfilled his duty. The world that had once seemed so heavy, so full of pain, was now a memory. His mission was complete, but the weight of it all had not been in vain. His eyes lingered on the earth one last time, on the people, on the land that had suffered so much. But it was not to stay. Upward he ascended, higher and higher, until the very air changed, the world below nothing more than a distant, fading image. He could feel the pull of the divine, a force stronger than any he had ever known. The heaviness of the earth, the burdens he had carried for so long, seemed to melt away. All that remained was the light. A light so pure, so bright, that it would blind anyone else, but not Enoch. He had been chosen. As he rose, the clouds parted to reveal the court of heaven. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was not a place of fear, but of beauty. He felt no terror, only awe. Around him, angelic beings with eyes full of wisdom watched silently. Their wings stretched wide, their faces glowing with an inner light that spoke of eternity. The angels did not speak, for there was no need. Enoch knew he was in the presence of something greater than anything he had ever known. He was taken by the hand of an angel, and together they ascended beyond the clouds, beyond the stars. The universe stretched out before him in all its vastness, a creation so immense, so delicate, that it almost broke his heart to see it. The angels whispered their praise of God, and he could hear the music of the spheres, the song of creation that filled every corner of existence. And there, in that moment, Enoch realized the true scale of the world, of life, of everything. He had been a mere speck in the grand design, but in the eyes of the Creator, he was a part of something eternal. His ascent took him higher than the sun, until he reached a realm where time did not pass. Here, there was no decay, no sorrow, no death. There was only the everlasting presence of the divine. And as he stood in that space, a feeling washed over him. It was as if the truth of everything had been revealed, a truth so vast that it left him trembling. But the truth was not one of fear, it was one of hope. In heaven, Enoch was given a new role, a new purpose. He was to be the divine scribe, to record the judgment, the prophecy, and the fate of the world. His writings, the sacred tablets, were not just warnings, they were beacons of hope. His words would echo through the ages, a reminder of the path humanity had taken, and the path that lay ahead. He had seen the fall of the Nephilim, the destruction of the earth, the flood that had washed away all that had been. He had witnessed the judgment of the fallen angels, the watchers, who had dared to step beyond their bounds. He had seen the birth of a new world, one that would rise from the ashes of the old. And now, he would write it all down. The words flowed from him as if they had always been there, etched into his very soul. He wrote with the grace of a man who understood the weight of his task, but also the peace that came with it. His hand moved steadily, his mind focused on the task at hand. He wrote of the days to come, of the destruction that would be wrought by the flood, but also of the redemption that would follow. He wrote of the mercy of God, of the love that could still save a broken world. Enoch knew that these words would live on long after he was gone. His writings would be a guide, a warning, and a comfort to those who would come after him. The generations yet unborn would read his words and understand the consequences of sin, but they would also understand the power of repentance, the power of grace. As he wrote, his heart swelled with a quiet joy. He had been chosen for this task, not because he was better than any other man, but because he had been faithful. He had walked with God, listened to his voice, and trusted in his plan. Now, he was part of that plan, a small but essential part of the great work that was unfolding before him. With each word he wrote, the world seemed to grow brighter. The pain of the past, the suffering that had marked humanity's history, began to fade into the distance. There was no more sorrow here, no more fear. Only the steady, unyielding hand of God, writing the future with the ink of eternity. The light around him seemed to pulse with a rhythm, like the beating of a heart. And in that rhythm, Enoch found peace. He had done his part, had borne witness to the greatest truths of all. And now, he was where he belonged, among the angels, in the presence of the divine. As his task came to an end, he felt a final warmth, as if the very heavens themselves were wrapping him in their embrace. Enoch's time on earth had ended, but his legacy would remain forever. His writings, his prophecies, would be a beacon to those who followed, a message of hope in the darkest of times. And in that eternal moment, as the stars above shone brighter than they ever had before, Enoch knew that he had been a part of something beyond his understanding. Something that would outlast even the stars themselves. The floodwaters had finally receded. What was once a world filled with chaos and corruption now lay quiet, still, as though even the earth itself was taking a breath after a long, violent struggle. The mountains, now bare of the towering floodwaters, rose like ancient sentinels watching over a new world, a world that had been reborn from the very depths of destruction. The air was fresh, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and new life. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sun shone down with clarity, casting golden beams across the land. It was a moment of peace, but it was a fragile peace, one that hung in the balance, as if the earth itself knew it had been spared only because it had been given another chance. Humanity was also left to face its own renewal. The few survivors who had been spared through the ark, the ones who had once been led by Noah, now stood in awe of this new world. They marveled at the way the plants began to sprout once again, how the animals returned in greater numbers, how the land, now soaked in the tears of the old world, felt alive with the pulse of a fresh start. Yet even in the beauty of the new world, there was a quiet, unspoken grief, the loss of so much. The flood had not only washed away the wickedness, but had taken so much good with it, too. Families, friends, entire villages had disappeared beneath the waves. Noah, standing among his family, looked at the vast emptiness around them and felt the weight of it. This was a second chance, but it was a chance forged from destruction, and he knew that rebuilding would not be easy. Still, they had to move forward. They had to carry the memory of the old world and what had happened, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the grace that had allowed them to live on. But even as the earth seemed to heal, there were scars that remained, silent echoes of the fallen angels and the Nephilim. The legends had not disappeared. They lingered, passed down through whispers and stories, carried on the tongues of the survivors. Children grew up hearing tales of mighty beings that walked the earth, giants of unnatural power, born of gods and men. There was no denying it, the blood of the Watchers still coursed through the veins of those who remained. Some spoke of heroes, great men of old who could lift trees with ease or strike down enemies with a single blow. Others spoke of great battles, ones that seemed impossible to win, yet somehow ended in triumph. These stories were not just stories, they were memories, remnants of a time when the Watchers had walked the earth. The mighty had left their mark, not just on the land, but on the hearts of those who had witnessed their power. Even though the Nephilim were gone, their legacy could not simply be erased. It had been carved into the soul of humanity, for better or for worse. The ancient whispers began to take shape, not just in tales of heroes, but in the growing fascination with the unknown. What had happened during those dark days when the Watchers had fallen from heaven? What had driven them to defy God so recklessly? These were questions that would never fully be answered, but they haunted the minds of many. In the quiet corners of villages, in the shadow of the new world that was slowly being rebuilt, the stories of the old gods persisted, wrapped in both awe and fear. The stories of the Nephilim, their strength, their might, and their tragic end, became something of a warning to future generations. The flood had been a cleansing, a moment when the earth had been washed of its sins, but there was a fear that such corruption could rise again. And so, the myths of the Nephilim took root, becoming cautionary tales for those who might one day forget the consequences of pride, of defying the will of God. But there was more. The influence of the Watchers had not just been physical. It was in the knowledge they had imparted to humanity, secrets of the earth, of the heavens, of things men were never meant to know. It was whispered that some humans, the descendants of those who had been touched by the fallen angels, held strange abilities. Some could commune with the spirits of the earth, others could heal with their hands, and a few seemed to possess an unnatural strength. The legacy of the Watchers was not just in the myths, but in the very blood that flowed through certain families. The gift of knowledge, of power, had not been fully erased, and some feared that it could awaken again in those who were not ready for it. As the generations passed, the story of the flood became more distant, faded into the past, but the warning lived on. The flood may have washed the earth clean, but humanity's heart had not been so easily purified. It was easy to forget, easy to assume that the new world would be different, that it would remain untouched by the corruption that had once run rampant. But the truth was that no world, no person, no soul, could ever truly escape the mark left by the Watchers. Their influence would never vanish entirely. In the quiet moments of the night, when the winds whispered through the trees, the memory of the old world would return. And in those memories, the legends of the Nephilim lived on, not as myths, but as warnings. The flood had cleansed the earth, but humanity was left to remember the power of the fallen angels, the strength of the giants, and the price of disobedience. The stories may have softened with time, become tales for children and foolish adults, but deep in the hearts of the survivors, there remained a caution, a reminder: the flood had not been the end, it had been a new beginning. And the world, though cleansed, was still fragile. The aftermath of judgment was not simply a time of renewal. It was a time of reflection, of remembering the past and using it as a guide to the future. The world had been cleansed, but it was up to the people to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. The shadows of the Watchers may have faded, but their story would never be forgotten. And in that knowledge, the people found both their hope and their fear, the fear that the flood could come again, and the hope that they could rebuild a world worthy of the second chance they had been given. Enoch stood at the edge of eternity, gazing down at the world that had once been his. He had walked its soil, breathed its air, and now, from his place in the heavens, he watched it all unfold before him. Time stretched out beneath him like a river, flowing in currents of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure. The sight of it was breathtaking. Yet, in his heart, there was no peace. There was no joy in merely watching. He had seen too much, witnessed the cost of rebellion, the pain of judgment, and the hope that had burned so brightly, only to flicker and fade in the winds of human frailty. It was a world of contradictions, one that he had helped shape, one that had been shaped by the very decisions of the angels and the descendants of those fallen from grace. Enoch had seen humanity rise from the ashes of the flood, rebuild itself, and strive for something better. But he also saw the shadows, the cracks in the foundation that were still there, hidden beneath the surface. The echoes of the Watchers were everywhere. Their legacy was woven into the very fabric of human history. He watched as the generations passed, some rising to greatness, others falling into the same mistakes that had led to the flood. The kings and the rulers, the warriors and the builders, each one seemed to carry the weight of the same choices, the same struggles. He saw the rebellion that had begun with the Watchers repeat itself in every generation. Humans, like the fallen angels before them, reached too high, touched the divine, and fell. And yet, there were moments that touched his soul, glimpses of grace, acts of kindness, sacrifices made in the name of love. Even after everything, even after the flood, humanity still fought for redemption, still sought the light. It was as if, despite the weight of their mistakes, they refused to give up on the hope that had been planted within them. He saw their struggles to rise above their nature, to build something lasting, to be better than they were. Sometimes, they failed. But sometimes, they succeeded, and in those moments, Enoch found a glimmer of what could have been, what still could be. The fire of rebellion, which had burned so brightly in the hearts of the Watchers, still burned in the hearts of men and women, though now it often manifested in different ways. The thirst for power, the desire for knowledge, the struggle to control forces beyond comprehension, it all felt so familiar to Enoch. He saw it play out time and time again, like a cycle that could not be broken. Nations rose and fell, kings were crowned and dethroned, and in the background, the same ancient question lingered: how much would humanity sacrifice for power? How much would they risk to defy the very laws of heaven? Through it all, Enoch was a silent witness, not allowed to interfere, not allowed to change the course of history. He could only watch and feel the weight of everything that had passed, everything that had yet to come. His role had been fulfilled. He had warned, he had pleaded, he had written the tablets that would endure for generations. But now, as the centuries passed, those words had become just another part of the past. The people would have to choose their path. And the consequences of their choices, for better or for worse, would be theirs alone to bear. He could see the grand sweep of human history, the rise of empires, the fall of kings, the birth of new ideas, the clash of nations. Some moments were filled with hope, others with despair. The world had changed, but the heart of it remained the same. Humanity, it seemed, would always be caught between the desire for redemption and the temptation to turn away from it. Enoch's heart ached as he witnessed the consequences of choices made in the dark. His mind wandered back to the days before the flood, when the Watchers had first descended. He remembered the hope he had felt back then, the possibility that things could have turned out differently. But the weight of their rebellion had been too much to bear. He had seen their fall, their punishment, and the devastation it had caused. And yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, Enoch could not help but wonder if things could have been different. What if the Watchers had repented? What if humanity had never been swayed by the Nephilim? What if they had turned their hearts toward the light instead of chasing the shadows? But there were no answers to those questions. The past was done, and the future had yet to unfold. All he could do now was bear witness, a silent observer of the story that was still being written. In the quiet of heaven, the angels spoke to him, but there were no words of comfort. The judgment had been cast. The Watchers were bound, their fate sealed, and yet, the consequences of their rebellion lingered on, like ripples in a pond that never quite faded away. Enoch understood that now. He had witnessed the destruction of the giants, the cleansing flood, the fall of the Watchers, and the redemption that had followed. But none of that had erased the scars, the echoes of the past that would continue to shape the future. Through the veil of time, Enoch saw the fleeting nature of humanity's victories. Each generation would rise, each generation would fall, and the eternal struggle between rebellion and redemption would continue. And yet, in that struggle, there was something that Enoch couldn't ignore. There was always a chance, always a moment when humanity could choose differently. It was this possibility, this spark of hope that still shone through the darkness, that kept him watching, kept him waiting for that final moment when the heart of humanity might turn completely toward the light. As the ages passed, Enoch remained a witness to it all, a witness to the enduring struggle of the human spirit, to the ever-present tension between the forces of rebellion and the call to redemption. His visions of the past, of the Watchers, and of the flood remained as a reminder to those who came after, a reminder that the choices made in the shadows could have eternal consequences. And so, Enoch stood in heaven, his gaze fixed on the unfolding drama of human history, knowing that the lessons of rebellion, judgment, and redemption were not just stories of the past. They were stories that would continue to be written in the hearts of every man, woman, and child who walked the earth. As long as the earth turned, the struggle between light and darkness, sin and redemption, would remain. And Enoch, in his eternal silence, would watch it all unfold.